Ladies and gentlemen, our Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Jon.
I hate it when I make an interview plan and then I have to rip it up. This weekend I ripped up the interview plan that I had for talking to you. I do want to talk about Ukraine and the state of things as they are, but you have just now delivered your final statement in the Commons. What was it like?
Well, it was the Defence Command Paper refresh. So it was moving defence forward. It was incorporating the lessons of Ukraine and, trying to pave the way for whatever comes next in defence spending and making sure that we're match fit for the future.
And we'll come on to the wider issues. So, you are still Secretary of State for Defence, aren't you?
Today.
Because there's a rumour.
There's a reshuffle tomorrow, the day after. Yeah.
In which case, this will be your last hurrah.
In that case, I'll just be over there in the seating with everyone else.
Why did you decide that you'd had enough?
Well, there's a man over there that slightly inspires me to go on your own terms. I think I'd done 4 years. I'd done 3 years as security minister. That's 7 years of sort of 24/7. It hadn't been quiet on my watch. So 2017 terrorist attacks, WannaCry, Salisbury poisoning and security. And then we did the refresh of contest and all that. And then defence has never really stopped. And ultimately, I wasn't going to stand at the next election. I think it's only fair to the sitting Prime Minister that he goes into the next election with a Defence Secretary that's not going to say 6 weeks before I'm off. And I wanted to sort of go on my terms. And I think it is probably really important for the mental health of myself and my family that you leave on a high.
But given the urgency of Ukraine and the fast unfolding events and your centrality in involvement, were you not tempted to stay on until the general election because it is such a vital job at this moment?
When I was in the army, people used to say there's always another operational tour. You can always stay on for one more operational tour and one more and one more. And you used to see people basically exhausted and also, they came to the end like everyone else and it was sort of, there is no more tour in the end. And I never did anything without thinking about the wider team I have. I have a really good team of civil servants, of military leaders. I've appointed all the chiefs now. Continuity matters. I've appointed new DG, Director Generals in the department, the PUS, nearly all the leadership of defence I've appointed. And, in the end, someone else will take it. I think President Lincoln said the cemetery is full of indispensable men. Ultimately, the momentum is with Ukraine. It doesn't need me. I will always support it. I will do my best. There's lots of other ways to influence it, but I think it's fair to the Prime Minister that as I'm not standing, somebody else takes the realm.
Did Rishi Sunak try to dissuade you?
I think I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I think he understood the reasons. He was very understanding of the reasons when I said to him, look, I've really done my bit. I've done my time. It's time to move on. So I think, he understood the reasons and, he's a Prime Minister that wants to fight the next election. So,
And the rumours about the reshuffle tomorrow, you wouldn't have said that, I don't think, unless you thought there was some strength to the...
Well, the rumours go... It depends who you talk to at the top of government. I spoke to one very senior member of the civil service who said it's definitely happening this week. I spoke to a very senior member of the government minister who said it's not going to happen this week. But it's going to happen, right? It's going to happen either this week or the first week of September. And that's just the way it is.
What about the toxicity of politics, the kind of social media scrutiny? There was some story about you yesterday, which you replied to very amusing.
It was the Hunt saboteurs said I was having an affair with Liz Truss and doing copious amounts of cocaine. And they're not linked as an observation, by the way. And I just replied, I'm surprised you didn't identify me as coming from the planet Krypton or something. Sometimes these people are so ludicrous, you just have to sort of... I was sort of toying with them. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have done, but is politics more toxic? I think it's harder in the media. I think sensationalism is trumping truth more and more across mainstream media. And I spend a large part of my time, maybe too much, correcting things that just exhaust you. You know, there are mainstream media who write things that it's just rubbish, right? It's not true. And that's exhausting. Mainstream media, social media is, there's a lot of hate out there on social media. It's rather sad that that's a reflection of society, but also there are good people out there as well.
But do you think that will affect the quality of the politicians we get? I mean, maybe this isn't a pejorative thing to say, but I would say in this cabinet, you kind of stood out as one of the grown-ups, as sort of, not here today, gone tomorrow.
No, I think probably politics' dirty secret is that the number of people applying to be MPs across all parties is much lesser than it was 20, 30 years ago. I remember safe Tory seats would have 600 applicants. A friend of mine from the North West Labour Party said a few years ago that a really solid Labour seat, they had less than 100 applicants. They had 20 or 30. Now, go back 30 years, never would have happened. And I think there is an effect on people wanting to do it. And the demands of the public, of the media, of the people you're there to serve, but also of all the other people around politics are such that it is a 24/7 job. And I was taught a long time ago, I think by Ken Clarke, you've got at least 4 masters. You've got your association, your constituents, the government or the party, and you've got your family. And you will never please more than 2 of them at any one time. And,
The other suggestion about you going was that you were pretty fed up, angry even, at not getting the NATO job as Secretary General.
No, I never set out to be Secretary General of NATO. I set out to do what I've been doing on defence. It was a sort of nice to have, Mark Rutte we thought was going to be the next Secretary General, and he made it very clear, I think early in the year, that he wasn't going to put his name forward. And I think President Biden had on 2 occasions talked to him about it, either this year or last year. So when that became an opportunity, I thought, well, that would be something good to do, time to exit my time here. But it wasn't something I'd harboured in me for 10, 20 years. I think I could have done it. I think I would have understood the wheels that are required. But there are plenty of other candidates. And I think that the Americans probably wanted a head of state. If I have a theory, I think they thought 31 members, what they really want is the next Prime Minister or President.
So do you think it was the Americans who blocked you?
If you think the electorate of the Tory party MPs are a curious bunch, the 31 nations of NATO with no process, no ballot, no one ever declares actually that they want to be a candidate. That's the first puzzle. So who knows how it worked. There were obviously competing views, but I think it was interesting. I got on very well with the French. I was with President Macron the week before. Actually, I'd be very aligned to some of how France feels about the future direction of NATO and European defence and investing in our defence and questioning some of the things. And I think people just take people at face value. I don't think they ask the details.
Did the Prime Minister give enough of a push?
No, he did.
Because I've read that the French blackballed you, the Americans blackballed you.
I don't think we got...
Rishi Sunak blackballed you?
No, Rishi Sunak really worked hard on it. I looked at all the readouts from all his bilateral meetings. I can't thank him enough for trying, and he really raised it on a number of occasions, direct with everything from the President to his interlocutors. I had quite a lot of support from lots of people, but there is ultimately a question about, I suppose, who's going to lead an organisation of 31, and I suspect they wanted a head of state. And then, of course, you get into the other power blocks of the EU, Europe, Atlantic, positions on China, positions on Russia, hawkish, not hawkish. I mean, we heard the stories about it's time for a female head of NATO. That's great. Of course, you also want somebody who's going to spend 2%, right? So suddenly you get down to Eastern European women, the brilliant Prime Minister of Estonia, and of course they're too hawkish for potentially the Germans or the French. So suddenly you start getting into this sort of a wiring diagram that doesn't seem to please anyone. So I did say at one stage, well, we should all just get used to the Secretary General from Iceland. I mean, poor old Jens is doing a 3-year job over 10 years. I mean, it's just impossible for anyone to move on.
So let us move on to the substantive issues of NATO and what is happening in Ukraine. I suppose the one thing that has happened that, I think it was Emmanuel Macron who was saying that NATO was brain dead, and no one would say that now. It's found its reason to be. in a way that was unimaginable prior to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Is NATO in a stronger position? And we hear about the fraying of NATO unity. What is more remarkable in your mind, the fraying or the extent of the unity?
Well, first of all, NATO has worked. Throughout this war, an ever more aggressive President Putin with constant threatening red lines that usually then melt away, he hasn't dared go near NATO. Russia has been very, very cautious of respecting NATO's territory. We have not seen, lashings out into the areas like Estonia or Latvia. They have been absolutely considerate of Russia, of NATO. We've seen provocation in the air, a Russian aircraft going into airspace, but they have been really, really cautious to make sure that they don't provoke. So you could argue the alliance in itself functions, the deterrent of Article 5 functions. But Macron wasn't that wrong, right? Is that post-1991, NATO had just stagnated, right? So all the things that used to be really important in NATO, such as common standards, so we all buy the right type of shell or the right type of caliber missile or whatever it is, didn't matter, you could fire them from your own platforms. All of that had started to drift. So back in the Cold War, every bridge in Europe had to be able to take 40-ton vehicles so that you could move your armoured vehicles. That had all gone. I mean, at one stage I worked out that large parts of our armour were just defeated by a bridge because people had given up a long time ago and just built whatever they wanted. So that common standard, the working out of moving vehicles around Europe on railways, it all just gone quiet, gone dead. Many populations in Europe would have been surprised that NATO was a nuclear alliance. They'd just forgotten to talk about it. And so it didn't have plans to do what happens if. They had just died, really. And now we see regional plans, which I think 4,000 pages of very detailed plans of what happens in scenario B. We've seen a reinvigoration of what NATO needs and the Supreme Allied Commander needs to do its job, and new domains.
And the counter-offensive, is it making progress?
It is. It is making progress. It's making hundreds of meters a day, sometimes a little less than 300-400, sometimes a little more.
I heard one of the leading Ukrainian generals saying it's not going as fast as we would.
It's not. Funny enough, there's quite a lot of history here. If you look at US generals and British generals in the Second World War, Patton would often complain about the speed of British advance. But it was an advance. And the Ukrainians are having to learn on the job capabilities that they didn't really have. Combat engineering and the way they configure their forces is not how we do it in the West. In the West, we have combat engineers quite deeply into our organization. These are people that lay mines, lay bridges, remove obstacles, cross obstacles. They don't quite have that in the Soviet army originally. So they are learning as they go. The Russians are just throwing mines everywhere. That, of course, slows it down. But what I would say is the Ukrainians have not committed their reserves yet, so they haven't gone all in. They are still advancing, albeit slowly, on 3 fronts, east and 2 in the sort of southwest. They will inevitably make a decision on which is the axis, and then they'll commit their reserves. So it is not yet worryingly slow. It is just brave men and women having to fight their way through minefields, and a Russia that, if you remember, doesn't care about its own. It's got a big meat grinder. But what was interesting about Prigozhin and his dash to Moscow was it demonstrated Russia doesn't have much of a reserve. The fact he could drive 200 kilometers within range of Moscow and no one stopped him showed there isn't much left of the Russian army.
Has the West been too slow, or maybe the better phrase is behind the curve, in supplying Ukraine what it needs? And you kind of you take the debate back a year. Well, we're not going to supply that, and then 6 months later you are, and there's still the debate over F-16s. So we're going to train pilots to fly F-16s, and will F-16s be in the theatre there?
I think the charge of being too slow could be applied before the invasion. Between 2014 and the invasion, there should have been a much greater effort to lethally equip Ukraine. It was very few of us. we were the first Europeans, and that was only a month before. The Americans had put in javelins, but had sort of effectively secured the javelins. They were in country, but they weren't free distribution. But once it started, there was sort of debates about could they have tanks earlier, could they have done things. I'm not so sure. I mean, what we've always tried to do is give them the effects they require. So a fighter plane is a good example. A fighter plane does three things. It does anti-air, it shoots down other aircraft. It does combat support, so it supports troops in the field. And then it does deep strike, so it hits targets like headquarters 300-400 kilometres away. We've managed to give them all those capabilities in a different manner. So the Storm Shadow missile hits in the deep, 200-300 kilometres away, the target. The HIMARS did 80 kilometres. The handheld, and now we've got Patriots, anti-aircraft missiles. They can shoot down other Russian planes, and they do. And then the close air support, interestingly enough, opens up a question for ourselves, which is one of the highest attrition rates of the Russian attack helicopters, right? Because they're really vulnerable. So what you see on the front line is a lot of use of drones, dropping hand grenades, or sort of one up from that, doing a similar job to supporting troops in the field. So I don't think, if we'd given everything on day one, it would have all been brilliant, and it would have been much, much better. Because also people have to learn to fight and use them. I remember when HIMARS and the M270s were introduced, the initial instinct of some of the Ukrainians was to use them in the same way they used them in the Soviet army. Well, they'd have run out. They'd have run out in about a week, right? These are precision munitions that need to be targeted precisely, and you need to triage when you use it and when you don't. If you use a precision mission, if you've only got so many missiles and you use it against a tank, you'll run out.
Do you think this war is winnable, and winnable by which I mean that Russia leaves all Ukrainian territory, the Crimea, the Donbass, etc.?
I think it is winnable. I think Russia is much more fragile than people want. The Russians want to admit, for sure. I mean, if you look at the generals being fired, you look at Prigozhin. If anyone predicted last year that Prigozhin was going to march on Moscow, General Surovikin, who is currently resting in Moscow at the moment, he's one of their most capable generals, right? So the splinter in the hierarchy of the Russian army is very real. The casualty rates are horrendous. I mean, it would not be wrong to say at least 230,000, 250,000 dead or injured Russians. Now, in 10 years in Afghanistan...
And I think I'm right, the British Army is 82,000 people?
It's 100,000, if you add the reserves, it's about 110,000. In 10 years of Afghanistan, they lost 15,000 men. So that is the mindset of Putin. I mean, you have to ask yourself, and one of the things that I felt way back when this came to be the issue, and I first went to Ukraine in 2016 as security minister. I remember thinking something had changed when Putin used nerve agent at Salisbury. That was the real wake-up call, that this was a man who supposedly had been on a journey from the Soviet Union, authorizing the use of a banned substance, nerve agent, on the streets of a county town without any real regard. I remember going to see the discarded perfume bottle, which was 98% pure. It would have killed 3,000-4,000 people if it had been distributed differently. It had just been chucked under a bush in a park. We went to a small park in Salisbury, and I went with the chief constable and the head of terrorism. And he was saying, I'll show you where it is. And there was a man sitting on the bench eating his sandwiches. And these policemen and spooks were pointing at the bench he was sitting on. And he looked up, and I thought, I can't tell him. But I think that is an example of that would have come from the top. And when you see that, someone's making that decision in a NATO country, things had changed, the rules had changed. And one of my battles between then and lethally arming Ukraine was persuading parts of our system that the game of chess had already begun, right? Putin was doing this. I remember saying in one meeting, security meeting, the game's afoot, right? The game of chess has begun. Either you're going to play to a draw or a checkmate, and half the system didn't want, no, nothing's begun. Well, it had begun.
And China? How worried should we be about an increasingly militarized China?
I think the thing we should worry most about China is inexperience. In its military and its diplomacy, you'll often see it goes from 0 to 100 really quickly. There's no, I mean, if you remember in COVID, Australia made a comment about wanting a WHO investigation. And Chinese state media immediately briefed that Australia was the gum on their shoe and immediately went into attack mode. And diplomacy is supposed to be graduated. Military response is about experience. And I think, first of all, we should worry that an emerging, more assertive China doesn't yet have that experience, and that could lead to miscalculation. Secondly, we need to have a proper political plan in the West. I don't mean unilaterally as Britain, but how do we deal with greater competition, with aggressive attacks on sovereignty in the South China Sea and freedom of navigation and theft of fishing grounds and all those things that cause regional dispute in the Pacific between the Philippines and the Vietnamese and everyone else, and Taiwan as well. And I think I'm not yet sure we see a mature political plan from the West of how to actually do what we want to do to avoid any conflict, is to say, how do we change your behaviour? What do we want China to do differently? And how do we indicate how to do it?
I'm going to end where I started, which is you. So what are you going to do next?
I don't know. I mean, I joked about working in a bar. I mean,
I reckon you'd get a job.
I was a ski instructor. I was trying to work out if I could work from home as a ski instructor my last 2 months in Parliament. I'm going to, I live up in Cumbria, Lancashire. I'm going to go back up there. I'm going to do what I started. I'm going to finish off my political time going to see my farmers and my schools and all that sort of thing, because I think that is important. And then I'll explore. And I mean, anyone got any job offers? Unless you're from Undercover Panorama, where you try. I've had a very nice offer from some dodgy South African firm already, who I don't think probably exists. I think I'll take my time. I think what I do.
Well, good luck with whatever comes next. And as they say in the United States of America, where I was based for a long time, thank you for your service. Ben Wallace, thank you.